So glad to be here. Always fun and nerve-wracking speaking after Kelsey Hightower, but I've got to do a couple events with him, so hopefully I've got a little bit of his swagger. We'll try. I'm gonna rip through the slides. I think we've seen a lot of slides today. I think the team's done a great job kind of presenting Anthos and the pieces, and I hope everybody understands that it's more of a platform play. It's more of like lots of different tools put together to really solve the problems that we're all having. And then we've been working on, my team and we've been working on a demo that we keep adding on to. We got to show a little bit of it in New York last week. So hopefully the demo gods treat me well. I got backup plans, of course, because I've had things go south a few times in my career. So let's get into it. We're mostly going to talk about this kind of middle layer, the service operator side. We're going to talk a little about day one use cases, day two use cases. This is the piece, I think someone asked earlier about the GKE on-prem. I look at this as just another region. If you need GKE and you need it in your data center, we've got an ability to deploy it on VMware today, and it just looks like another region. So I'm much more interested in like what's up the stack. We'll get a little bit into the application framework, but we've been working a lot with Knative also, but it's mostly gonna be about config management, Istio service mesh, a lot of the telemetry tooling, and things you can get into. So we're gonna talk a little bit about day one. Day one's more about how you build your apps and how you deploy things. So we're gonna use the Hipster Store. I don't know if anyone's ever seen the Hipster Store, but it's a true microservices cloud native application with lots of different pieces. We're actually deploying that across 3 clusters. One of them's an on-prem cluster, one of them's in Canada, one of them's in the US, and we're doing that all through config management. We're also gonna layer on a service mesh across all of that, set up mutual TLS, we've automated all the certificate pieces, and then we'll show you a little bit about what the on-prem piece looks like. And let's be honest, someone's gotta fix the leaky pipes, and I think one of the biggest challenges I think I've seen with my customers who have adopted Kubernetes is you have a team that builds it and they're really excited about it and they get something up, and then it's got to go to the ops team. And many times the ops team wasn't involved in this or they're not trained. So this transition's very hard. So like, what are the tools you're going to use to operate this at scale? How does it fit into your enterprise tool chain? We'll show you some of that stuff. So Kelsey talked a lot about the GitOps approach. That's how we're going to deploy everything we have here today. We'll show you some stuff around traffic shaping. So someone from the QA team could literally go into Git, make a change, and direct traffic to different clusters and scale them up and things like that. And if we have time, I'll show you a little bit about how we can recover these from when they're broken or when someone deletes something by accident, and some metrics and logging pieces. These are the pieces we're going to talk about today. So we have config management. That's really an operator that's going to be watching all our clusters. Kelsey touched on that this morning, so I'm not going to get too much into that. The cloud service mesh is probably the coolest piece of all this. So all of these clusters automatically joining a service mesh and able to exchange DNS information, be able to securely talk to each other in an automated fashion. No more going to the spreadsheet and picking out IP addresses and debating over which ones you get. This is all automated and into lifecycle piece. And then we've got GKE on-prem and GKE in cloud. This is what the on-prem environment looks like, and I'll give you a quick view of it, but essentially it's a VMware cluster. We're running it on a bare metal service in cloud, and it's a 5-node cluster, I believe, with 3 physical servers behind it. So it's pretty beefy. We're gonna deploy this Hipster Store. So you can see these are all microservices that have to talk to each other. The piece we're gonna play around with is the front end. So we're gonna scale out the front end. We're also gonna distribute traffic from on-prem to 2 different sites. So think of it as a good retail use case. You've got your cluster on-prem, you need to scale out to cloud for a bunch of events, Black Friday, Justin Bieber wears the jeans I have on today, and then you gotta scale up your site. So that's become pretty easy to do. Unfortunately, our Hipster Store doesn't have any toques in stock, but we're working on those. Again, we talked about config management. I think the biggest parts of this is think of it as a policy engine. Think of it as if you lay down your code in Git, you can control this at scale across any number of clusters. And instead of people hands on keyboard into clusters making commands, the GitOps approach is operators should be using version control too. So go into your version control repos, make changes, roll them through tests, do peer reviews, and then that's how your infrastructure should be changed. And rollback becomes very, very easy when you take this approach. If everything's done from code, rolling back is as simple as going back to another branch and approving it, and everything will revert back to the way it was before. More on config management, but let's get into the demo. So this is what it looks like. This is our on-prem cluster. We've deployed every service as part of the Hipster Store into the on-prem cluster, and we've only deployed the front ends into our 2 GKE clusters. We could do this in any way possible, but what we're doing is bringing the traffic into our on-prem, and then we're extending this for scale. You could certainly do it the other way, bring all your traffic into Google, use Google's traffic management, and then create a service mesh to be able to have your databases on-prem. Maybe you're not comfortable moving data out to cloud, but you can have that presentment tier and that auto-scaling capability, and you can size for average. We're just doing it the other way in this use case, so most of the pieces are on-prem. So let's get into the demo. So what I'm showing you here is this is the on-prem cluster. This is our cluster in Canada, and this is our cluster in the US. We've got a config file set up for each of these clusters so we can interact with them. So if we look at our on-prem cluster, we can look at our nodes. So there's our nodes. They've been up for 4 days, this cluster. And if we go back and have a look at this is essentially our vCenter environment. So the way GKE and what Anthos does, it automates all the provisioning of all your virtual infrastructure into vCenter. So you don't have to build virtual machines manually. You're not using templates. It's all done through the API. So I've told it I want a 5-node cluster. I'm using a big IP virtual appliance for all the front end. And that's fully orchestrated as well. When we build an ingress policy, it goes into the F5, carves it up, builds the whole flow. When you tear it down, it tears it back down also. So that's kind of the boring part. Everybody's seen VMware and vCenter many times. This is what our cluster looks like. So we've got our Canadian cluster, our US, and we've got our on-prem cluster. We'll get into some of the ops functions in a little bit. If I go back here, and what we've done is we've set up a simple shell script to be able to deploy config management. So what config management is going to do is it's going to deploy the operator on all 3 clusters, and then it's going to sync with a Git repo, and it's going to push down all the configuration that we have to all of these clusters. It's also going to deploy all those microservices and set up the service mesh, mutual TLS, all those pieces. It's going to do it in an automated fashion. So if I run the setup script, I've got a watch command going here on all 3 clusters. What you're going to see start to happen is we're pushing an operator out to these clusters, so it's going to create a namespace called config management. It's going to sync up with our Git repo, and it's going to look at what config should be pushed down to these clusters. So you can see we've started to deploy our front ends in the 2 different clusters, and then you start to see all the services deployed on our on-prem cluster. So it all happens pretty quick. Just to show I'm not all smoke and mirrors. Here's our Hipster Store. It's not loading right now, but you can see it's starting to come up. If we go back to our GCP console, you can start to see if we go into like our on-prem cluster, you can see our nodes here. There's all our nodes. We can go into workloads. So everything's manageable through the GCP console. So if you're not comfortable with kubectl, you can manage this all through here. So you can see some of these services are starting to come up. You can start to sort by cluster. I want to look at my on-prem cluster. I want to look at my namespaces. And I want to look at my Hipster Store namespace that's been created. So here's all the services that are starting to come up in that. Let's see if things are loading yet. So now our site's up. We've got our service up. You can see it's all pretty much the same color banner. We're able to, it's pretty fast. So let's get into a use case where we want to start to scale some of these up and down. So let's go in. We'll go into our front end service. Let's go to scale. We could certainly set up auto scaling in this case, but we're going to scale this up to 10 more. So you can automatically see our pods are starting to scale up. let's go back and so we go into, we can kind of mine through our clusters. We'll go to Canada. We can go to our namespace. You see we've got our Hipster Store deployed there as well. We've only got one service in the cloud. Same thing, we can scale up this service to 10. If you go back, there's our watch. We're watching to see all the pods come up. Now, we can do some kind of destructive stuff like delete our entire namespace and delete all our deployment configs. You can see everything's starting to terminate, but what you notice is we automatically got one running again. Because config management says I'm always going to be running at least one pod with one sidecar. So it's going to always push things back. If I go and delete that whole namespace, it's going to recreate it from scratch in about 20 to 30 seconds. So you can see it's already self-healed itself back. Now, if we wanted to go with auto-scaling and different metrics like that, we could take it out of the config management space and let Google manage the auto-scaling components of that. So everything's up and happy. We've got our Hipster shop up. We've automatically deployed all the telemetry that comes with Istio. So you can see we've started to collect traffic. We've started to look at all these different pieces. So let's go and do some traffic shaping. So this is a use case where maybe what we want to do is we've got a lot of our traffic pointing to one cluster. And we want to start to be able to distribute this because we already scaled up the other clusters. So this is the GitOps approach Kelsey was talking about. So normally we wouldn't do this through the GitHub UI. Normally we wouldn't auto approve our own pull request, things like that. But let's flip to like a 50-50 traffic split. So there's no reason why we couldn't have a pre-approved change that allows someone to go into ServiceNow, be able to say I want to change traffic from this site to this site, and be able to just submit a request, goes through an auto approval. We're basically editing one file, which gets pushed out to any number of clusters, and then things are going to update. The Istio service mesh is going to start to decide how it's going to shape traffic now. So if we go back to our Hipster store, you see we've started to hit our remote site now. So now if we go and click around the site, we're going to start to flip back and forth between the two front ends. So in this case, we're leveraging all three clusters for our front ends, and everything's on the service mesh hitting all those back-end services. So our cart service, our database, all the back-end stuff that needs to talk to your legacy infrastructure. You can keep that all on-prem, but we can move all of these services that we need to scale and be able to traffic shape very, very easily. And again, you can leverage the dashboards to start to get telemetry and start to zoom in on things. Let's refresh this. The other piece that's interesting is tracing. So we have this Jaeger interface. All of these components are open source. So if I steal one of Kelsey's terms, like this is kind of like Istio the hard way. We've built all of this ourselves on GKE. What you're seeing with what they're doing with Cloud Service Mesh is they're going to take all these components and they're going to wrap them into the GCP console like I showed you earlier. So it's all in one place. You can do telemetry, you can do metrics, you can do logging. But you can start to dive into these traces and be able to look at like slow response times. You can see who's talking to who. You can really dive into the analytics of this. The other piece that's very interesting is this Kali dashboard. So you can start to visualize all your services. We've got a load generator running against the Hipster store to generate traffic. So you can start to look at all these different traffic patterns and you can start to dive into this. I think a lot of people know to set up this amount of monitoring and get it right is really, really hard to do. There's no reason why you can't share these dashboards out to the other teams, dev teams. Go troubleshoot your issues. Don't always just throw it over to ops. We have to enable them with tools if we're really going to be able to operate a platform at scale. So those are some of the tools. So if we go back to our GCP side, you can also look at some of the ingress policies and all of the services that you've deployed in here, and you can all scale them up. So there's nothing wrong with using, obviously, kubectl and managing it from command line or using policy manager, but you can see everything that's going on in here, and you can certainly give someone read access to all of this. You probably noticed on the Hipster store, we don't have any of those annoying SSL termination, like false certificate warnings. We've automated all this with Let's Encrypt. So every time we build a cluster, we go out and dynamically generate certificates. We pull the certificates, we distribute them across our clusters. So certificate management can be completely automated, which is a very painful thing for most customers to get a certificate. Finally, let's do a couple destructive things and watch things kind of recover. So let's do it on the main cluster. So if we look at our namespace here, there's our Hipster Store. Normally you would never want to do this. You would never really give anyone access to do this. But if you do it, the nice part is this is going to smoke the entire namespace. Our application's gone, all our certificates are gone, everything's dusted. But within a few minutes, config management is going to it has a watcher, and it's going to say, this is not like my source of truth. This is not what it's supposed to look like, and it's going to recover our site back to normal. The other nice part is, even though we've deleted our backend, if we keep refreshing here, we should hit the remote cluster, and we still should be able to present. All right, well, that wasn't part of the demo, but we can fix that quick. Let's see if I picked the right one. So this is kind of a scenario where we've kind of screwed up. We want to send all our traffic to our cloud site again and be able to kind of recover from that. If we go back to our watch here, you can see all our clusters, it's come back to life. It's kind of recovered it from scratch. And our Hipster Store should be coming back to life pretty soon also. So it's starting to come back up. There's our site back up. And then the nice part about this demo is you can really learn from it, but if we want to do a full cleanup, we just destroy everything. What it's going to do is it's going to delete config management off of all the clusters. It's going to say I have no state anymore. It's going to clean up the environment from scratch, and then we can run through this demo again and start to iterate and kind of practice this stuff. So all these clusters are pretty much ephemeral. We're just using non-persistent storage. So if things go south, I can just build all this out from scratch again, take about 5-10 minutes, and then be able to iterate. So for test dev, there's no reason why we can't give our development team full clusters and let them play on stuff that looks like production. So I think that's it. I'm out of time. So I'm going to put a blog up that'll go into this much more in detail. We'll share some code. If you want to try this stuff yourself, you should be able to just leverage GKE and leverage some of the techniques we've done. And if you have any questions, just reach out to us on our website, and we'll help you along the way.